My name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm an Asia Program Associate here at the Woodrow Wilson Centre. Because this is going to be placed on our website, the webcast or the recording is going to be placed on our website, I'll just take this time briefly to introduce the Centre for those of you who don't know what our mission is. The Wilson Centre was founded in 1968 by an Act of Congress. It's the nation's official memorial to President Wilson, who as many of you will know, was the president of Princeton University and the only president to date to hold a PhD. So the centre is dedicated to bringing together good politics and good scholarship, which we sort of see as the two most important aspects of Woodrow Wilson's life. And we have the privilege of hosting a number of scholars each year at the Woodrow Wilson Centre, and we also have the sad task of saying goodbye to them. And normally we have, we ask our scholars to give a presentation at the end of their stay here, but I hear that Jojo has extended his stay to July, so we haven't got rid of him yet. Jojo, or Patricio, I've never used your real name, Abinales, is a professor at the University of Kyoto, where he's taught for the last 10 years, or since 1999, and he has also taught at Ohio University. He received his undergraduate education in the Philippines. He's a native of the Philippines, and he did his grad work, both his master's and his PhD at Cornell. He's the author of a number of books on the politics, society, and history of the Philippines, and is a regular contributor to media outlets there. Jojo won't be going back to Kyoto at the end of his stay here, or he may be, I don't know, but from August he's taking up a new position at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, at the Pacific and Asian Studies Center there. So we wish him all the best in the future. Jojo.
Thank you, Bryce. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming this afternoon. Before I proceed, I'd like to express my profound gratitude to the Wilson Center, the Asia Program, especially to Baba Hathaway and the Asia Program staff for giving me this opportunity to come here in this wonderful place of research and reflection. And allowing me to share with you some of the preliminary study reflections on my research project, which revolve around a certain puzzle. Why is it in the southern Philippines very few Americans get kidnapped? And why do Filipino Muslims love the United States, whereas the U.S. is hated or criticized extensively abroad? So I entitled my talk, "The Other Americans in the Second War." The war on terror, for obvious reasons. Let me start with this news item. On March 30, the March 30, 2011 issue of USA Today, Jim Michaels, the journalist Jim Michaels, who spent his time with U.S. Special Forces in Basilan, the largest island in the Sulu archipelago. Do you have any laser things? I can. This unit were in Basilan Island to provide intelligence and training support for Philippine Marines and Army units pursuing the terrorist group called Kidnapping Enterprise, the Abu Sayyaf Group, and assisting local governments in rebuilding the infrastructure in these conflict-affected areas in what the Bush administration in 2000 called the Second Front in the War on Terror, and in June 2000, which the acting ambassador to the Philippines in June 2005, Joseph Mussomeli, referred to as the new Afghanistan. This is the second front, and this is Basilan. Michaels was effusive in his praise of the success of the American support of Philippine counter-terrorism operations. He wrote, and I quote, "Though not widely known, the Philippines was once threatened to become an epicenter of Al-Qaeda. In the 1990s, before the late Osama bin Laden became a household name in America, top Al-Qaeda leaders such as September 11 mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed were in this Pacific island chain developing ambitious plans to strike at America and the West. He added, and I quote, "The small U.S. contingent gave the Philippine military the tools and know-how to decimate Abu Sayyaf on its own at minimal cost in lives and dollars." And I think, yeah, there you go. Oh, sorry. Okay. And this is true. Since the program was implemented, only 17 American soldiers had died, 3 in bombings, and the rest in a helicopter crash. In contrast, the Abu Sayyaf had been decimated from a force of 1,200 in 2001 to only about 400 today, and 28 of its leaders have either been killed or captured. And while American taxpayers are shelling out $2 billion a week in Afghanistan, the cost of the Philippine operations have been a minimal $50 million a year. So when Michaels asked Brigadier General Edward Reeder, commander of the Army Special Operations Command in Fort Bragg, about this, the latter replied, and I quote, "Nobody understands it better than the soldiers that have experience in the Philippines. They understand counterinsurgency. It is a future model for counterinsurgencies." Absolutely. Okay. But I'm afraid General Reeder is a little bit off the mark here. For the two distinct peculiarities in the report that struck me while I was reading it. The first is the location. Okay. While some U.S. forces are indeed embedded in the main island of Mindanao, the main units are concentrated in Basilan, a forested, sparsely populated island, half the size of Rhode Island, and located in the farthest point of the Philippine map, which the majority of Filipinos have not even visited. Okay. It's a very beautiful place, actually. I was there 2 years ago. Secondly, it is also an island where counterinsurgency, the way we understand counterinsurgency, may not work. The Abu Sayyaf doesn't have a political base. It is mainly a kidnapping enterprise, and people in Brazil know where these guys are located. What makes it complicated in terms of going after them is that it's a rainforest, and overlaying all this relationship within the Abu Sayyaf are family and clan ties. So in fact, if one were to really talk of a serious, real and serious threats to the state, to the Philippine state, these can be found in the larger, better armed insurgents operating in Mindanao Island and not in tiny Basilan, which include, referring to two, and I refer to two major groups, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which operate in central and southwestern Mindanao, an armed Islamic movement with claims of having 14,000 armed guerrillas. It is the current vanguard in its Muslim dreams to separate Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago from the national body politic. And the other threat, of course, is the Communist Party of the Philippines, which is the guerrilla army, the New People's Army, now supposedly 8,000 strong, where its strongest regional organizations and regional guerrilla bases are in the northeastern and central Mindanao. You see, the Communist Party, of course, has the dreams of replicating Mao Zedong's Yan'an in the Philippines. These two movements possess enough power and influence to keep parts of the country unstable. But the United States, for both diplomatic and political reasons, has kept its forces away from being involved in dealing with these insurgencies. Maybe Kathy can explain why. So just give you a sight of where quote-unquote terrorism incidents are happening. Okay, and these are the war zones in the Philippines. Excuse me, okay. Then there's the tail end of Michael's report, where he mentions the United States Agency for International Development and its $100 million support, quote, to boost the Philippine economy and build government institutions in the Muslim-dominated southern Philippines that have quietly thwarted Al-Qaeda's intentions of gaining a foothold in Asia. Now, how exactly did USAID do this? Michael did not elaborate to his readers. The successful adventures of men with guns proved to be more exciting to an American audience, wary of stories of failures in Afghanistan and Iraq, and unpersuaded by stories of success. But I would suggest in this presentation that almost a decade before the Petros Doctrine became the popular orthodoxy in Washington, Afghanistan, and Iraq, it was actually civilian agencies, civilian officers, of officials, civilians linked with the USAID through its largest umbrella program, the Growth with Equity in Mindanao, or GEM, that had demobilized insurgents and prevented them from returning to the battlefields. USAID through GEM and for a while with the Office of Transitional Initiatives have limited the ability of other groups, with the exception of the Abu Sayyaf, to expand their operations and spheres of influence. But most important of all, it is these civilians who have catalyzed local development, no matter how small, in these war zones. Now, I wish to, this afternoon, I wish to illustrate this by exploring the successes of the USAID's Livelihood Development Program aimed at ex-combatants of the Moro National Liberation Front, the MNLF, which is different from the MILF. It preceded the MILF, which the MNLF waged a, I guess, two-decade war against the Philippine government starting in 1975 and declared itself the vanguard, again, of the Moro struggle to separate against Western and Filipino colonialism. It fought the Philippine government in the 70s and was largely instrumental in undermining the consolidation efforts of the Marcos dictatorship in the 70s. By 77, 78, 60 to 70% of the Philippine army was in the southwestern and Sulu parts of Mindanao and Sulu archipelago, and the Marcos government was supposedly spending $1 million a year just trying to contain this rebellion, which was very much well funded by Libya and the Malaysians. Yeah, a cousin of mine who was a lieutenant during that war used to, come home during Christmas and complain that they had very bad supplies, while the MNLF was funded by the Libyans and the Malaysians from guns to toilet paper. So after a few years of open warfare, with neither side winning, the MNLF and the government shifted to the negotiating table, again with the help of Libya, the Organization of Islamic Conference, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The rebellion compelled the Marcos government to create the autonomous region. I hear that. Oh, sorry. Here. Again, conflict. The autonomous region for Muslim Mindanao. I lost my, sorry, I'm so bad at this. Okay. Which gradually became the institutional focus for many discussions in the southern Philippines and large and beyond on how Filipino Muslims should rule, should operate and rule on their own. In 1996, the MNLF signed a peace agreement and accepted government offers to integrate its forces to the armed forces of the Philippines, and its leaders were appointed and or elected to regional and local offices created to address the needs of what the Bangsamoro, the Moro nation. The government also promised a mini Marshall Plan for Muslim Mindanao, and sought the assistance of the United States, Europe, Japan, and the Arab states, as well as international multilateral agencies like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. The U.S. was one of the first to respond to this request to assist the MNLF, and out of this was created the Emergency Livelihood Assistance Program, ELAP, which was funded by USAID and implemented by GEM and USAID the Office of Transition Initiatives. ELAP started in 1997. They signed a peace agreement. My daughter played some with this, so there you go. ELAP started in 1997 with USAID allotting $1.7 million and OTI another $2.1 million. USAID was able to leverage something from the British government who added another $200,000 to the program. The bulk of the fund was to go to livelihood projects, directly to livelihood projects of 4,000 MNLF ex-combatants who were not integrated into the Philippine military. In 2 years, USAID added another 7,000 beneficiaries. The beneficiaries were organized under clusters of 25 to 50 people living in contiguous production areas with access to land or in communities with access to the sea. ELAP specialized on rice, corn, cultured fish, and seaweed, all quick maturing commodities that required relatively simple technology and had readily available markets. Overseeing ELAP was a management committee, or a MANCOM. I'm sorry, I have to go through this, be patient, which was composed of representatives from USAID, the Philippine government's National Economic Development Authority, the Moro National Liberation Front's NGO, Bangsamoro Women's Foundation for Peace and Development. It's all where all the wives and the women guerrillas join. And the Southern Philippine Council for Peace and Development, a development body created by the Philippine government purposely as institutional largesse to be handed to the MNLF. At the local level, there were implementation committees, or IMCOMs, were set up, consisting again of MNLF state chairmen, because the MNLF divided in Mindanao and Sulu Archipelago into states. Again, representatives of the Bangsamoro Women NGO, the MNLF National Unit Commands, but there was another body that oversees the state commands, and the staff from GEM and OTI. IMCOMs were tasked to identify, select, prepare project sites, brief beneficiaries on the goals, mechanics, and procedures, and limitations of ELAP, and ensure that the appropriate peace and order conditions prevail in the sites. So here was where OTI, keep in mind the maps of where the conflicts are, and so it's all very much in the war zones. ELAP formally ended in March 1999, but its success convinced Washington to continue with the program and provide it with a bigger budget of $4.7 million. OTI decided to go its way, separate from GEM, and opted to set up one of its, quote, support which implements fast transition program, or SWIFT program. I think it's still being applied now. It's still ongoing, with a budget of $1.5 million. Now, for the rest of my presentation, I would like to focus on the GEM side of the program because it became too long, which is now, after the first phase, renamed to the Livelihood and Economic Assistance Program, LEAP. I'm going to focus on this because it has a longer history, and OTI's impact was really largely very minimal. Okay? When you go back to these places now, and I ask about what kinds of, which American institutions have provided you aid, OTI's SWIFT has largely disappeared. Everything now is associated with GEM, much also to the consternation of USAID Manila. But that's another story. Okay, so these pictures. This is the chairman of the Moro National Liberation Front, Nur Mizwari. Okay. So an evaluation report prepared in 2001 by a research group from one of the local universities, commissioned by USAID, was asked to evaluate ELAP, and in its evaluation, it described the program as having helped 28,000 ex-guerrillas, so 10,800 ex-guerrillas, of which over 90% were able to maintain their farming operations. About 4,000 of this graduated to another GEM project called the Targeted Commodity Expansion Program, which is a program that explores expansion into other crops and allows these graduates to join new business associations beyond their areas and even connect to markets. Just a wonderful picture later of one of these ex-guerrillas with a cell phone calling his buyer in Taiwan. Okay, so let me just go this evaluation. I'll just press to that. Okay. So ELAP eventually evolved into LEAP 2, and as you will notice, there were more communities taken over. Okay. So TSIP, this is the Targeted Commodity Expansion Program, where a lot of the graduates from ELAP and LEAP eventually joined. So here's the picture of this guy. The picture that's missing here was of him 10 years ago holding an Armalite rifle. So it's a wonderful picture of him trying to call his buyer in China, I think. To just give you a sense of what the products were: seaweeds, corn. Notice the guns. This is the solar dryer. What is it called? This is a solar drying facility, which also functions as a basketball court when you clean it up. So, okay, just give you a sense. Oh, okay. Okay. Now, apart from the economic success, there were also political dividends. GEM's final report on LEAP stated glowingly that the programs GEM and OTI started have been instrumental in keeping the peace in many parts of the conflict areas of Mindanao. In fact, when large-scale fighting broke out between the MILF and the Philippine government in 2000, the widely anticipated major movements of former MNLF combatants into the ranks of the IMLF did not occur. One of the principal reasons for this was that so many of the former MNLF combatants were not led to joining the fighting and discouraged the movement of MIL forces through their areas to protect their farms. Okay? Now, implementing the program, however, did not come easy. When I interviewed them, some of the people who initially implemented these programs, the livelihood projects, recalled how in the early days that they had to, quote-unquote, whittle away at the walls of suspicion and resistance the former combatants built around themselves and their communities. I'll go back to this. They also understood that the MNLF may be articulate when it came to demanding development. These guys can argue, and aid, but very inexperienced when it came to dealing with post-conflict environments. Having spent much of their adult years in the jungle or in military training in Libya or Malaysia, I actually interviewed some who got stuck in Libya. They could not go back. Many of the middle and lower level commanders had no skill other than firing, disarming, and assembling weapons. This, I would later show you, had a big problem on husband and wife relationships. Or in the words of one MNLF leader, his followers had, quote, rusted minds, who not only thought of one thing before ELAP came, to fight. So impoverished when they came out of the jungles, the MNLF guerrillas immediately demanded the resources they believed they deserved. One GEM manager observed how deeply ingrained was what he called the entitlement syndrome among the participants. The combatants saw economic assistance as an opportunity to, quote, grab as much as you can, give it to the family and friends, especially if you wish to generate political capital later. Okay. Grab enough money and then run for the village office with your guns. To this economic motivation, we must add the lingering suspicion towards Filipinos. Many of these areas where USAID and through ELAP began to open their programs were virtually isolated from the outside. Their isolation reinforced further by the becoming war zones. So to many MNLF combatants and their families, the first time they ever met a Filipino was a man in uniform. Okay? The image of the Philippines to a lot of these people was somebody, a man in a uniform, ready to attack their village, burn their homes, kill them, steal their properties, and rape their women. So when GEM managers often mused how surprised many of these combatants were when they met a Filipino who was not a soldier but an engineer and a technician and who brought quote-unquote gifts instead of starting to fire their guns. So GEM started with the assumption that these beneficiaries needed basic training in not only production skills, but they also have to be trained closely. And here, what was different between OTI and GEM, and between GEM and other development agencies, was that they went directly to the communities and rather than go through local provincial officers or even NGOs representing these communities. The other thing that was interesting was pretty soon, because GEM relied on a big staff of Filipinos who grew up in the area, they began to realize that, quote-unquote, cultural and tribal practices were very important in dealing with the communities. So acting like amateur ethnologists, actually one of the managers, this wonderful accountant, wrote a manual on do's and don'ts in Muslim areas. It's a very funny piece. Anthropologists will find it really crude, but if you're an engineer and you bring it with you into these areas, it was actually a good guide. They should deference to the communities which they describe as quote-unquote leader-oriented. And they constantly reminded themselves that working in these areas, in these clusters, one must not discount the leaders who, quote, has multiple ways and means of disrupting implementation in an area. And as such, these leaders should be given due courtesy and importance appropriately and promptly. GEM also was familiar with the factional divide in the MNLF. When the MNLF signed its peace agreement in 1996, it was a shell. It was a very weak version of its older self. It was divided into 4 factions: Its leadership could not unite, and its combatants were mainly getting old. And aware of this factional divide, it made sure that these divisions, these political and affiliations and connections, would also play a role in determining in the selection of communities and clusters to form. So that by maintaining regular contacts with these leaders for factions, they were able to be equitable in the distribution of resources and not show a bias. And this in turn allowed them to turn the factions into their active defenders, okay, in the implementation process. Okay? And in exchange for getting their compliance, the GEM and USAID did very little to interfere in this factional politics. Even if this meant taking some serious detours in the implementation process or investing in one leader's dream project despite evidence of its economic infeasibility. And Jim started clearly also a debate over demobilization and the issue of demobilization and disarmament. Okay. The ELAP, when they in their website, they always highlight this from farms to arms program, which is a way of showing that this is what has happened to the ex-guerrillas. But when you go down to the field and talk to them, they used to muse and say, well, it's actually farms with arms. And the reason for this is you are going into an area where the Philippine Army continues to be mistrusted, where the police are instruments of warlords and political clans, and where criminality remains endemic. So part of the success of a small enterprise has to do with how adequately you protect them. So allowing the MNLF to keep their arms, therefore, indirectly enabled GEM to come up with its own security force. What was not written in that MSU evaluation report was this fascinating thing of what did they do for their first incomes. Big bulk, 60% said they decided to buy new implements and facilities, expand. About 30% said, they will buy new equipment. Okay. And then another percent said, well, dowry. Okay, that's categorical dowry. And the category is very funny because the 30 and the remaining percentage was very funny because assistant meant most of them would buy, the first thing they do is buy a motorbike because, it's easier to go around small areas in your motorbike. The other one is to buy TV. If you go around these parts of Southeast Asia, there's a lot of illegal satellite discs all over, such that you can actually get if you go in the south, you can actually get your Indonesian, even as far as Middle East TV. So they buy satellite discs illegally, of course. The pretext would be because I want my children to be educated. The third favorite commodity to be bought are guns. And here, with the first income, and thank God for the U.S. and Philippine government, Philippine military exercises, there's always a constant flow of new guns. So for these guys, once part of the income goes to buying new guns, and this guy actually was proud of his gun. But the fourth one is to buy a new wife, get a new wife, and it usually happens, according to some of the correspondents I interviewed, was that suddenly there was a proliferation of marriages, of dowry, because now first wife who was with the husband in the mountains now could not have babies, so you come down with your income, you get wife 2 or 3 and 4. In fact, one of the guys I interviewed, I'll show him his picture later, was this wonderful 72-year-old man who had 4 wives and 28 kids, and kept thanking America for the economic assistance that allowed him to expand his fishing his fishing project and made him a bountiful man. So for that matter, use of arms as part of the negotiation. So arms were the GEM therefore was able to find its own security force in the MNLF. Now, while now subjected to criticism, the notion that Muslim men value their guns more than their women struck GEM managers as an opportunity to project power also to their beneficiaries. Okay? Apart from, of course, coming in and say, I represent the U.S. government. So, hence, you will notice in the next 2 slides, the head manager of ELAP, this friend of mine from the University of the Philippines, always went talking to the MNLF beneficiary carrying his own asset and making sure that he appreciated also their firepower. So there's this fascinating process where you have all the civilians also, my gun to your gun. Before we talk about livelihood projects, inputs, and technical support, let me show you my gun. So it was Farms with Arms that was one of the fascinating things that I noticed when I went around the area. So you have to take pictures. The other picture was of these GEM guys, testing this grenade launcher. Okay. But the other important thing actually was that GEM understood the role of the Bangsawan or Women's Foundation for Peace and Development as a critical partner in these livelihood projects. A lot of people realize that by the second year of ELAP, GEM realized how critical Muslim women were in the post-war society. Again, and I mentioned this earlier. Remember that the husbands came back from the mountains with nothing but with no skill other than to shoot and disarm their weapons. So in the 15 years that they were in the mountains, their wives and their daughters were the ones running the trade, learning how to survive, sending children to school, going to school themselves, and setting up the businesses. Such that one of the consequences of this the peace process, is when the husbands came down, very much like after World War II, the wives wouldn't give up the independence and the power they've they've accumulated through the years. The husbands, of course, would occupy the television, would be in the headlines, Commander so-and-so. They were the ones who would always be interviewed. But at the end of the day, when you look behind, there's always a powerful woman leading and determining what to do. So GEM early on realized that for some of these projects to be implemented, you go through the women. And the other thing was recognizing the traditional role of Muslim women in women in Muslim society. And one of those traditional roles is the role of mediator of conflict within the community. It is not the MILF or the Abu Sayyaf actually, which is the main source of instability in southern Philippines, Mindanao, but it's actually clan conflict. Bloodletting conflict through generations of different families. And some of what is reported as clashes between the MILF and the government actually arose from conflicts between families. The way to end this conflict is to bring the women, to allow the women to negotiate in behalf of families. So by creating an NGO led by women, also senior women commanders of the MNLF, GEM was able to facilitate entry into communities and navigate itself through villages and sites where there was constant clan conflict. And which meant that throughout this area of instability, there were all these islets of economic growth and stability arising partly because of the contact that these women had. Then there is the question of local power. Development workers in Mindanao constantly complained about the difficulty of getting local governments to come up with counterpart funds or services because they lacked the resources or had stolen them or therefore bankrupted their provincial and town coffers. This accordingly had messed up the process of delivering goods and services to the war zones. But actually this is more than just an issue of delivery. It was also a question of how much these agencies knew about local politics in the war zone. International assistance to Mindanao, especially after 1996, was justified on the grounds that the Muslim provinces were the poorest in the country and that the MNLF rebellion was as much driven by a separatist ideology as by pervasive poverty. But only recently have development agencies come to recognize the debilitating impact of clan politics and warlordism in these provinces these people wielded powers through their private armies and turned their local offices into sources of booty and spoils. This, you've heard this 2 years ago. The old man, Governor Andalan Patuan, and his son, he's in prison now, accused, accused of having perpetrated the killing of 58 people 2 years ago in one of the provinces. The clans, of course, are also very much not power in themselves. They are also very much married to national leaders and power blocks in the Philippines, okay, such that you have the same guys who perpetrated the massacre in 2008, a year before, with the Philippine president cutting ribbons in some development area. And actually, this is the second one is funny. This is a Catholic, the president was obviously praying as a good Catholic, and the 3 Muslim warlords were praying too. Okay, so these clans represented the other power block in the southern Mindanao zones, and some of them actually sided with Manila in their fight against the MNLF and the MILF. And while others have found a way to coexist with rebel groups, we're in an unwritten, fragile live and let live relationship. So when you go around southern Mindanao and south central Mindanao, you actually think in terms of territory. Once you cross the river, it's like, oh, that's the territory of so-and-so. And there's a live and let live relationship there. The people at the other side belong to one group and the other side with another group. So GEM had to deal with its personalities and families in its infrastructure and investment programs, and its managers were sensitive to this tense relationship between the clans and the insurgent groups. So that in implementing ELAP, it knew it could not ignore the clan-controlled local governments. And in its final report, it actually acknowledged that the staff must constantly be alert to the peace and order situation and the nature of local politics in their areas. But towards this local power, the teams were able to limit their contact by just merely extending to the latter the usual, quote-unquote, usual courtesies when the team appears in the scene. And Jim categorically stated that the team would never surrender to the local government's participant selection or veto authority. How did they do that? Well, first, of course, this. Okay, when you go to the communities and you say, well, I represent the United States government, that in itself creates a collective awe. Okay? You are the global hegemon in a way. And that what this allowed a lot of the GEM teams to mitigate or minimize efforts by these clans and these warlords to say, can I have my 10%? Or you can't go through here because that's my territory. So having the erstwhile, when you project power, it does help a lot, even symbolically, that you have either the ambassadors. These were the two ambassadors, American ambassadors, who were very much active in Mindanao. And if you have them, constantly in the field, it creates this sense that the Americans are really doing something serious there. And this is actually a very funny picture because you have the American military on the side, the GEM coordinator, the ambassador, and I think the 2 others are local politicians, aren't they? This one is my good friend, Benjamin Long, one of the warlords in Sulu Island, yeah. So you have this mixture where if you have picture and you project this at the community level, that the Americans are really serious about what they're doing, and you back it with either the ambassador or the local military, then people really will take you seriously. And it also helped that in the formulation of ELAP, we had a president in President Fidel Ramos who actually said, which deals directly with the community level. Unlike other development agencies that had to go through national agencies, what GEM's advantage was that it went straight to the Office of the President, and therefore allowed the Office of the President to play the role of mediation and institution that would pressure local officials into abiding and complying with requirements and regulations imposed on them. And finally, the GEM also sought the Philippine military and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And here, this is a very funny arrangement. For where the MILF has declared until very recently, in the last week, that it would separate the Mindanao and Sulu from the rest of the Philippines, it actually, one of the tactics it deployed was to seek the assistance of the United States. So here's an Islamic group committed to separating the government, but seeking the evil empire's assistance in facilitating talks with the government. and at the ground level, actually reaching out to American officials. This was actually a very controversial picture because the American ambassador actually went into rebel territory. Okay. What is not stated here is some of the interviews I did was in the process of expanding their livelihood programs, the GEM teams were gradually intruding into MILF territory, and were actually welcomed by the communities loyal to the MILF, who because of seeing what was happening in the MNLF territories were now becoming envious of the successes and therefore invited GEM into their areas. So you have all over the place, especially in the small road assistance programs, if you track where they are, this is one of the projects I hope to continue with, in which territory they expanded, you will notice a lot of them in the last 5 years, intruding gradually into the territory of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. So GEM's success, so the MILF actually sought out the help of the president, the U.S., and therefore, through this, GEM was able to argue that it was not only conducting a procurement exercises, but it was also assisting in the peace process. Now, but this did not come without any cost. Here, this is the last part of my paper. When asked what he thought about ELAP after the completion of its first phase, okay, you have this. You have on the one hand this view of the United States as one, the imperialists out to exploit our resources. GEM is part of a USDA idea, are part of a larger plan to reestablish American bases in the southern Philippines and project its power into Singapore, I suppose. And that the return of the Americans in 2000, and from 1996 to 2000 to Mindanao, is nothing but a 21st century edition of this long, brutal history of American rule connections with Muslim Mindanao. But when asked about ELAP, the MNLF, one of the MNLF beneficiaries gave this fascinating account. He said, "We in the MNLF were pleasantly surprised that the United States provided assistance to the Muslim communities affected by the war, given the history of its involvement in Mindanao. We did not expect that the U.S. would be among the first to respond and sustain its emergency assistance to the MNLF through the present time, expanding its coverage to more beneficiaries than originally planned." Another beneficiary said, "This was our first time to get any assistance, which we have long awaited for help for some kind to come to us. The Americans are giving us light. They help us have hope. If there were no Americans, we won't feel safe." And what of the Philippine government? Well, the third one is this. This is the guy, the 72-year-old guerrilla, my favorite guy, with 4 wives and 28 kids. He said this. I had to translate it. He spoke in his local language. And then the other one is this. See, you're not only talking of ML beneficiaries, but also politicians. Politicians who said, well, this is a famous Wahab Akbar. He was a governor of Sulu province. This was his famous quote where he said, "My dream is now starting to materialize after 10 years of not being able to purchase this equipment for my government because the Americans were able to provide him with assistance in building roads." What was not said, of course, that he stole the money. So Wahab Akbar, I think a few years later, that was killed in a grenade, an IED, just as he was entering the House of Representatives in the Philippines. The suspicions were on the MILF, but some people said it was a family war. Okay, but what of the Philippine government? When asked to rate the Philippine government's delivery services, some of the beneficiaries responded through this evaluation report, said that 57% of this was inadequate, and 18% complained that the Philippine government had not fulfilled its responsibility. This was the OTI report. And when I asked GEM officials if they heard similar complaints when they went around, they simply smiled. They were very diplomatic. And here, I think, lies the irony of the success of American economic assistance in Muslim Mindanao, in part because of the long history of neglect by the Philippine state on the welfare of Muslim minorities, and in part because of the separatist war, in which the first and only time a representative of the Philippine state visited Muslim areas and came with guns and in part because of the corruption arising from the patronage ties between Muslim elites and Manila politicians, the communities of Muslim Mindanao, especially the areas where GEM and ELAP had been implemented, had never put their trust on the national state. It is not only alien to them, it was their oppressor. And this peace agreement did not erase the social memories and continued popularity, and it continued its popularity through the MILF. With the MILF, which says they are willing to negotiate with the Philippine government, but they are not Filipino. And it's still a very strong undercurrent in Muslim societies. In fact, one of the stories GEM officials told me was when the USAID funded a couple of mosques in these war areas. So it's the usual, you come in, the representatives of the US government come in, the Philippine government come in, you have the Philippine flag, everybody stands for the American national anthem, and two-thirds of the people sit down when the Philippine anthem is sung, and you just have to say, okay. And so of these two actors then, who came in after 1996, the 1996 peace agreement was signed, it was the Americans that had the edge over their Filipino partners. And the success of ELAP and LEAP was the added proof to the popular belief that the Americanos were really more serious in having the interests of Muslims at heart than the Philippine state. What gives comfort to Filipino leaders, however, that this continuing alienation would not turn into a potential foundation for armed separatism, because the livelihood programs are succeeding. Okay? And besides, the beneficiaries are getting old. Their ages range between the late 60s and mid-70s, and these are hardly the commanders that could be relied upon when you go back to war. So in a certain way, here the irony of this economic assistance program, the more it succeeds, the more it creates this sentiment that at the end of the day, it's not the Philippine state that has been at work here, but it's been the dreaded Americanos. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay. I imagine there's a number of questions. Before you ask, could you please identify yourself and any institutional affiliation you might have? Not all at once. Here's
Why would it be in its interest to actually allow the Americans to show up the failures of the Philippine state so obviously?
They have no choice. It actually has no choice. It doesn't have the money. The second one, of course, was the premise that any recovery, any rehabilitation of this war zone can only be done with, the mini Marshall Plan. It's with extensive assistance from abroad. I mean, it is the third thing is this is a state that's been used to being provided aid, from Marcos. I mean, everything is always framed in terms of how much can we get from development agencies into helping this. So you have this fascinating industry of people writing proposals, okay, not aimed at the Philippine state, but actually aimed at external aid agencies. The second one has to do with the fact that the irony of decentralization, once a lot of these national agencies were devolved, Manila now would say, well, it's not our business anymore. It's the provincial governor and city mayor's responsibility to raise the funds. And in a certain way, that's sort of washing itself, because part of the resources now can be shifted to or maintained in used to support the army. Okay. And the Philippine Army is still very much a big presence in the southern Philippines. So it had no money. It has this habit of seeking assistance from abroad, and therefore, I think it has left it no choice.
Thank you. That was a good presentation, and you've really looked at it from the ground level up, which is, I think, very important to do. Because so often we see things from a Manila perspective, which is very Manila do not parallel those of the GEM people on the ground. And I think that you're right that you highlighted, and I think rightly so, that the GEM awareness of the situation on the ground, which I think is far more detailed and more accurate than what perhaps is at the policy level. I just make one comment about one of your last slides was about the moral attitudes toward the U.S. After what was a century of brutal suppression.
That's the nationalist.
That's the nationalist perspective. The moral perspective often is that things were never better than when the Americans were in charge, because they had the moral provinces. And the moral province was administered separately, first by the Army and then subsequently by the various American governors, generals. And I think that they saw the Americans really as a better option than the Filipino bureaucracy, which they eventually got. And as you know, they petitioned the U.S. Congress twice to please do not throw us in that briar patch. We don't want to be we want to be part of the Philippines. We'd rather remain a separate colony of the U.S. for a longer period if you can. Philippine lawmakers were more effective and more.
Yeah. Well, the initial impetus for this actually was my dissertation when I was doing my field work in southern Philippines in, that was 1990. And when I interviewed some of the elder people, older gentlemen, about the rebellions, one of this really, the 92-year-old man came back to me and said, why, first I come from, I'm Christian Filipino, and I come from the northern portion of Mindanao, which in the 16th, 17th century was the site where all these Muslims raided the communities. So I'm Cebuano, I'm Visayan, so among Muslims we were referred to as slaves. Okay, so I was then, this old guy told to me and said, a slave studying in America. And I said, yes. But the next question stumped me when he said, when is General Leonard Wood coming back to save us from the Filipinos? and that sort of, you then sort of realize there were two things that were fascinating here from the perspective of history. One was that, as Jean pointed out, for compared to the Spaniards who first colonized the Philippines, the Americans were actually the first to consolidate colonial rule in the South, basically integrate them and break the Muslim communities out of their Southeast Asian moorings. The second one was actually that this was an army, and it was the U.S. Army rule at a time when two things were happening. One, the army was starting to modernize. So these were all professional soldiers. Leonard Wood, if you track his history, he eventually came back and set up the first professional army. So these guys were given this, the opportunity to exercise, to practice some of their initial administrative training in the Muslim South. Immediately the conclusion they reached was that Muslim Mindanao was different from the rest of the country. And they were very patronizing and racist about it. They said, we have to civilize these guys. Okay? But civilizing them was very different. One, against the British, they said, we can't turn them into, we can't maintain the royalty. We have to turn these datus and sultans into congressmen. But the second and most interesting thing was that this would take, was that their argument that it would take two generations before any other thing, any other shift in administration would be undertaken, including integrating to the rest of the Philippines. Why? Because the Muslims were never Filipinos. And, they're savages, but they were never part of the Philippines. So that at the end of the army rule, the first separatists, actually the first to argue for separatism of Mindanao, were the U.S. Army officials, in consonance with a lot of these people. See, there was always Mindanao was always been artificially connected to the rest of the Philippines. When, after the army resigned and the politicians took over, the way Muslim Mindanao was integrated formally into the Philippine territory was through these politicians. Okay, patronage politicians, backroom deals. We're in for 100,000 votes of my constituents. You will win power in exchange for allowing you to rule like despots and autocrats in your villages. And that changed, of course, in the 70s. So you have this lingering history of detachment, of a sense of detachment, sense of alienation among Muslim Filipinos, or Muslim Mindanaoans, from the rest of the country. And of seeing that the only time that they were controlled and defended by a colonial power, who may have exploited them or whatever, was when those Americanos were there, when Leonard Wood, was there. So in a certain way, that has not disappeared. And I think that's also one of the reasons why it's difficult to write Philippine history from below, from this perspective. And why, for example, in the case of development areas, it was one of the innovative things that USAID did was to say, okay, let's not think Manila, let's think local. And then let's figure things out. Let's navigate our way. Let's lay out the land. There's a lot of grays happening there. What aspects of that gray zone can we tap to advance our program? So the farms with arms, for example, losing Bangsamoro women, working with the MILF informally. Those are the ways in which you navigate and ensure that your projects are implemented.
Bob.
Bob halfway here at the center. Jojo, to what extent are the USAID successes in Mindanao transferable elsewhere? Is this a program that is so specifically tailored to this particular location that it doesn't really provide us a template for other countries? Or is this something that, obviously with modifications, can actually be applied elsewhere on a wide scale?
Well, yeah, good question. Because I haven't been, one part of my plan was to start studying these other countries. But there were, I think, two distinct features of this project. One was that you have a longer history. U.S. government policy is always to award contracts on a rotation basis. But you have here a program that has been there for 15 years. In a way, partly because they were able to get the contract, but the long history enabled these guys to create, to learn, to accumulate experiences and come out with a way of dealing with things. They went native, as it were, and it's actually an interesting way that the two guys that are ahead have been heading this, have been there for, 25 years? Married to Filipinos, and but the other interesting thing really in this war zone is you let the civilians lead the way and come out with strict business transactions. Muslim Mindanao has always criticized, one of the portraits of Muslim Philippines was that Islam is a very important thing. What is often conveniently forgotten is that Muslim Filipinos are also one of the best traders in Southeast Asia. And it is in that trading aspect, on this entrepreneurial aspect, that you come in and say, I have a business deal with you. Okay? You keep your guns, I'll pick your inputs, I'll bring you rice and fertilizers and technicians. Whatever money we don't care where you get your counterpart funds. You can get it from, selling guns or, but we don't care. What is important is in 2 years, we have this business deal. And then if you do well, it's a very, as they put it, it's business. And I think that's one of the things that in these war zones people tend to forget because you ethnicize or you make religion a determining point. The third thing actually is you rely on the people below. I think 2/3 of GEM staff come from the area. And here, and I think family, communities, I know a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend, it has helped in opening things up. And I wouldn't be able to do this research if I didn't have friends in the USAID. They said, oh yeah, come here, let's go, come with us and let's meet this commander, so on and so. And that actually has helped a lot. But it means, therefore, it means a policy shift. You have to be able to say, okay, leave this company or this contractor or this agency, give it 15 to 20 years to establish rapport with the community and let it grow. There is, of course, checks and balances. The other interesting thing I forgot was that GEM is, unlike a lot of USAID programs, was multi-sectoral. It was a program which governed many programs. It's managed many programs. I think when it was implemented in 1996, correct me, Jean, it wasn't the norm. USAID didn't do that. It was single grants. You build roads, you teach children, But what happened was you have this umbrella program that has been able to oversee and supervise different programs, and therefore link these different programs to each other. So Muslim commander earns his first $50,000 producing grouper. It gets linked now to business support organizations, which is also supported by USAID in the war zones, these chambers of commerce that have been set up. So it is easier to coordinate under one if you have an umbrella program. And I don't know if USAID still uses that. I think it's program to program, contractor to contractor, 5-year cycles thing. It doesn't work that way. You have to go native. You have to think of different ways to coordinate different programs. And you have to let the civilians lead. It's very scary if you have a guy in a uniform there, because it doesn't open conversations.
This gentleman here. Yes.
Malcolm Church, long-time observer of the Philippines, and during that long period, I've seen a number of changes in Muslim areas, one of which is education. And I'm interested in this question of identity, Filipino identity, because it appears to me that there may be two opposing trends going on. On the one hand, you have one group that's saying we're not Filipinos and we're willing to pick up guns to prove it. It seems to me that there's another group, and probably correlated with education, which is saying exactly the opposite. We are Filipinos and we want to be accepted as Filipinos. Could you comment on that? Is my perception accurate?
There's a third group. We don't care if we're Filipinos, as long as the deal, as long as our livelihood projects are implemented. I mean, a lot of these guys, for example, have skipped the Philippines. They went to Taiwan. One of those guys at the picture, they're selling their wares to Taiwan, China. You actually skip the capital, and that's very fascinating about it. Formally, I'm Filipino, fine. There's a lot in these areas, for example, in Sulu. I told someone this, that there's some areas here in the Philippines, for example, in the south, where they're formally Filipinos, but most of the time the mentality is Malaysian. In Tawi-Tawi and Pagnima Sugala, when you go to these areas and small islands there, they always say, the Indonesians. Manila, it's over there. And in one of the small islets, I think it's Sibugay, where 365 days of the year, 364 days of the year, they're Malaysians, and on the 5th day, they're Filipinos because they have the vote. So there is a third thing, Malcolm, which is formally we're Filipinos, fine, but at the end of the day, in everyday life, we are more close to Malaysia, we're more close to the Indonesians, and we're more close to our communities. And I think that's the biggest challenge the Philippine state has, because its education program, its media, hasn't addressed this question of national unity, or has been addressing it badly. Yes.
Hello.
I'm Helen Rafael. I worked right across the Celebes Sea in Sulawesi for 2 years. I have never worked in the Philippines, but that's so similar, also Muslim. And as you know, both sides of the Celebes Sea have a lot of Chinese population, and in Indonesia, there are periodically pogroms killing many, many thousands of Chinese people. What's the attitude? And again, Indonesia has plenty of trade with China and so forth. What's the attitude in the Philippines? I don't hear about anti-Chinese or mass Chinese killings or anything like
In the
that.
southern Philippines, you mean?
In the southern Philippines or in the Philippines in general?
In southern Philippines, in southern Philippines, the Chinese have always been a permanent presence since the 16th, 17th century. Right, but the other thing is that they married into the elites, the local elites. So some of these mayors, for example, have Chinese last names, even if they don't speak Chinese. It's difference.
I have a question that may or may not be related. At the very beginning of your talk, you talked about a communist group, an organized communist group. First of all, did that have any relation with China? Secondly, what has evolved from how have they changed, and is
Oh, it's a long story, another lecture. But the Communist Party started as a Maoist group, and it actually sent some of its people to China and tried to smuggle guns in 71, 2 ships. But, you know, students are very bad. They were mainly the first leadership were students from my university. And students are bad smugglers. Anyway, so they were supported by China, and I think for certain in North Korea until 75 when the Chinese said, you know, enough of this, we're setting up formal ties with the Philippine government. But no, but they became more indigenized and more self-sufficient, and actually one of the last surviving communist parties in Asia. It split in the 80s after Marcos fell, and there was a serious bloodletting, especially in Mindanao. A lot of these people were killing each other. But the leadership, the old leadership has reasserted itself, the old Maoist leadership. And it's preserved much of its army in northeastern, north central Mindanao, partly because this guerrilla force was not involved in the killings. Yeah, it's a long story, but I can give another lecture if Bob wants.
Follow up on the question Bob asked. In Washington, very often we'll talk about aid, who the stakeholders are. People will come up with glossy, publications and talk about how they address this stakeholder and that stakeholder. And very often one gets a sense that a very good idea, the notion of human stakeholders, is co-opted by groups which have nothing to do with it, who really aren't stakeholders in the process. And so the question here is, how did this program avoid being, in a sense, co-opted into a larger discourse about how to solve problems? How did it remain, in other words, resolutely fixed on the local, and not just try to appeal to national and international interests?
I mean, the first thing you have to do, interviewing them about this, is how did this guy come about? It came about a series of accidents, First, in the 1990s, when the U.S. government got mad on the Philippine government for closing the bases, but there was enough money left, and people said, "Yeah, what will we do with the money?" And there's Mindanao, so they allotted $4 million to Mindanao, and these guys started building on it. There were some infrastructure projects that could be funded, and the money had to be spent. So there's a series of accidents with it. The second one is Mindanao. Nobody goes to Mindanao. It's where the Muslims and all the guerrillas are. It's a very strange place. You go to all the Filipinos here, if they're from Manila, you tell them you're from Mindanao, the first response is, "Oh, you're Muslim." I don't know. It's the second largest island in the country. But that's it. And in a certain way, it helped that you're in the frontier, in the periphery, because nobody bothers you. And therefore, having been set up a program there, actually, GEM started as an investment promotion program. It just fell on this livelihood project fell on its lap, mainly because it was there ahead of everybody else. Okay, so they were forced from engineers to become, conflict management evaluators. It's really funny, these guys, when they talk about how, hey, I was an accountant, for heaven's sake, now I'm in charge of security. And that allowed them to experiment. And, of course, come out with successful projects. And if the money is well spent, and it continues to grow. One of the things, for example, that enabled them to experiment was because one of the things that was a result of central government, Washington and Manila's apathy towards Mindanao, was they were able to develop this kind of an umbrella program, which nobody did. Okay, let's create an umbrella program. It's the infrastructure, business, rebels, etc., and let's see how it operates in a war zone. And before everybody knew it, it was there. And it also helped that the military then said, this is the second front, the war on terror, let's pour in some more money. But one of the fascinating things about all these military reports is that almost always anybody who goes to these parts of the Philippines have to go through GEM, have to go through the civilians who would say, okay, you go there, can go here, and all that. And it's a very fascinating local institution, local agencies, evolution of its autonomy by using its access and knowledge of local conditions. And I don't know if it's been replicated all over, but I doubt if it is. Or if it's replicatable, if Washington, our neighbors there, will allow it. I don't think so. I'm not sure.
Up the back there.
My question is also about aid and how it is being viewed as co-opted or being instrumentalized by different bureaucracies. My question points to two things. One, and you may have already explored this in your presentation. I came late. To what extent have you looked at the other players, if you like, actors behind the, if you like, success, quote unquote, of this reintegration and demobilization program? Beyond this partnership between USAID and GEM, because as far as I know, there are also other institutions that have been mobilized to also use their fund. For example, you have the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank that have been used, that have been providing a number of programs through trust funds. Some of these are actually going mostly to formerly conflict areas. Some of them are also being used for Mindanao reconstruction and development programs. And you have some very willing government institutions there to implement it. You have many of these, for example, governors and mayors in some other parts of Mindanao, such as Sultan Kudarat, Davao, and South Cotabato, which have been using much of this money to facilitate the implementation of a number of projects in some areas which used to be battle zones. And then you also have USAID giving out money to some U.S. civil society organizations or consultancy groups such as Windrock International, which is doing a number of renewable energy projects and community-based programs in some of these areas that have not been penetrated before by the military, but after the Mindanao War in 2000, many of these areas have been cleared to facilitate the coming of many consultants. You know the basics of the community organizing things. So I think the question for you, the question is that, do you think that the success, if you like, of this reintegration and demobilization comes from the fact that there are a number of willing donors and institutions to work on these programs? And number two, it's also the question about how do you measure success? Oh, I don't like the word. What are the indicators where this program actually works, where it actually scaled out? I ask this because there were cases when there were many commanders who, after surrendering their arms and taking money through the National Amnesty Commission or the National Program for Unification and Development, there were many reports that these commanders have actually embezzled their money and that many of their former members, were so disgruntled. So I'm interested about what do you mean by success?
Well, the one thing that I sort of probably wasn't able to explore farther in the talk was how much of GEM success has to do with avoiding government institutions. Actually avoiding institutions and going directly to beneficiaries, or where institutions and organizations are necessary, making sure that this would not hamper access to the communities. So, and here's the debate. World Bank, Asian Development Bank have money. There's a lot of money going on in Mindanao, but the main problem is that a lot of this has to go through local governments because that's the agreement between regimes, It has to be coursed through formal state institutions, and that is where the money disappears. And one of the fascinating things about GEM is that it lets USAID Philippines deal with that up there. Don't bother us there. So what's fascinating, actually, and I will never probably be able to write this, is that you don't find this in the paper trail. There's no paper trail. In the final papers, you always say, yes, we and the Philippine government, we love each other, and here's the rice. But it doesn't work that way. Okay? And I don't, so that's the first thing. It also doesn't trust civil societies, organizations, unfortunately, because they also function like states. They take percentage, 10% of the cut. Okay, So I think what was fascinating about this project is that, it basically treated these beneficiaries as would-be capitalists, would-be entrepreneurs, and dealt directly with them in a strict business sense. And I think that's where the success lied. The firearm amnesty program did not work because it was coursed through government. It was too formal too. I mean, why bother with firearms? And as you notice, it did not only steal the money, but they also gave away old firearms. That's always the practice there. Kathy and I were talking about it. It's not that they actually accepted the fact that it's a gun-driven society. And what do you do? How do you turn this gun-driven society to your benefit? Is one of the fascinating things about this program. You let them become defenders of their products, of their projects. So I don't know. I mean, Asia Development Bank, World Bank, they're also institutions with their own regulations and norms and how to present money. And I think, I don't know, I haven't studied them yet. I was just more fascinated with these people operating from below. Maybe next year when I go back.
Okay, we'll wrap things up there. If you could join me in thanking Jojo.
Thank you very much. Huh? I had to cut it 39.
Well done.
Thank you.